The dust of the high plains was a constant companion, a gritty film that coated everything Elias Thorne owned: his small, sturdy cabin, the weathered leather of his saddle, and the memories he'd ridden out here to bury. For 5 years, the silence had been his only law, the horizon his only judge. He was checking a fence line, the wire humming a lonely tune in the wind, when he found her. She was little more than a bundle of rags huddled against a fence post, a pale, still thing that didn't belong in the harsh landscape of sagebrush and stone. At first, he thought she was dead. He knelt, his knees cracking in protest, and saw the faint, shallow rise and fall of her chest. Her head was shaved clean, the skin of her scalp raw and chapped by the sun. She wore a thin, burlap shift, and her feet were bare, cracked and bleeding. He turned her gently, and that's when he saw the mark. Seared into the delicate skin of her neck, just below her ear, was a brand, a stylized letter B, stark and black against her pale flesh. It was a mark of ownership, a symbol of such profound dehumanization that a cold, familiar anger coiled in his gut. This was not the random cruelty of the wilderness, this was the deliberate, meticulous cruelty of a man. Her eyes fluttered open, dark pools of pure, animal terror. No plea, no sound, just a reflexive flinch away from his touch. Elias, a man who had sought nothing but solitude, who had sworn off the troubles of others, felt the ghost of an old duty stir within him. He looked at the vast, empty land around them, a place where a person could disappear without a trace, and then back at the branded girl. He could ride on. He could leave her to the coyotes and the sun. It would be the easy thing, the safe thing. But as he looked into her terrified eyes, he saw the reflection of a failure he could never outrun. With a sigh that seemed to drain the last of his peaceful isolation away, he gathered her frail body into his arms. She weighed next to nothing. He carried her back towards his cabin, each step a reluctant move away from the life he had chosen and back towards the man he once was. He laid her on his own cot, the rough wool blanket a stark contrast to her fragile form. For 2 days, she drifted between a feverish sleep and a state of waking terror, refusing food, flinching from the cup of water he held to her lips. Elias moved with a quiet patience he hadn't practiced in years. He sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, watching her, saying nothing. He knew that words were useless against a fear that deep. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. He found her awake, sitting up on the cot, her dark eyes tracking his every move like a cornered fawn. He wordlessly placed a bowl of thin oak gruel and a wooden spoon on the small crate beside the bed and retreated to the other side of the cabin. He watched as she stared at the food, her hands trembling. Minutes stretched into an hour before she finally reached for the bowl, scooping the gruel into her mouth with a desperate, famished urgency. When she was done, she set the bowl down and whispered a single, raspy word. 7. It wasn't a name, it was a number. Elias felt that cold anger harden into a cold resolve. He knew he couldn't keep her here. She needed a doctor, a safe place, but taking her anywhere meant exposing them both to whoever had branded her. The stylized bead burned in his mind. He'd seen it before, on supply wagons rumbling through the nearest town, Redemption Creek. The Blackwood Mining Company. He packed a satchel with a few provisions, checked the action on the old revolver he kept in his saddle bag, and strapped it on. It felt unnaturally heavy, a weight he had purposefully shed years ago. He looked back at the girl, at number 7. Her eyes were wide, a fresh wave of fear washing over her as she saw the gun. He tried to soften his expression, a foreign exercise for his weathered face. "I'll be back," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Lock the door. He didn't know if she understood, but as he rode away, the image of her haunted him, a ghost with no name, no hair, and no shoes, a living testament to a sickness he could no longer ignore. Redemption Creek wasn't a town that lived up to its name. It was a place of quiet desperation, its dusty main street lined with faces that were either exhausted or predatory. The entire town seemed to exist in the long, dark shadow of the Blackwood mine, a scar of industry on the distant hills. Elias tied his horse outside the general store, the only establishment that seemed to hold any warmth. The woman behind the counter, Martha Gable, had kind eyes that had seen too much sorrow. He bought coffee, flour, and bandages, feeling the weight of her curious gaze. "Haven't seen you in a while," Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice soft but direct. "Just needed supplies," he grunted, avoiding her eyes. He paused, feigning interest in a sack of beans. "Lot of traffic from the mine lately." Martha's hand stilled for a fraction of a second. A shudder fell over her expression. "Mr. Blackwood is a very industrious man. Brings a lot of work to the area." Her tone was carefully neutral, but Elias heard the fear beneath it. The bell above the door chimed, and Sheriff Brody filled the doorway. He was a big man, his guts straining the buttons of his uniform, his face florid and mean. His eyes, small and cunning, landed on Elias immediately. "Thorne," Brody said, his voice a low growl of suspicion. "Didn't figure you for the sociable type." Elias simply nodded, placing his coins on the counter. "Even a hermit needs to eat." Sheriff Brody's gaze swept over Elias's purchases, lingering on the bandages. He then looked pointedly at the Colt revolver strapped to Elias's hip. "Wearing that again, are we? Thought you were done with that life." Elias met his gaze, his own eyes flat and unreadable. "Some things you don't forget how to use." The air in the small store crackled with unspoken threats. Brody smiled, "A cold, predatory thing. Just make sure you're minding your own fences, Thorne. Silas Blackwood doesn't take kindly to people poking their noses into his business. And his business, well, it's the business of this whole town." He tipped his hat to Martha, a gesture of mock politeness, and swaggered out. Elias gathered his supplies, the message received loud and clear. Martha leaned forward, her voice a barely audible whisper. "Be careful. The coyotes in this valley wear badges." Back at the cabin, the girl, 7, was huddled by the cold hearth, the heavy bar secured across the door just as he'd instructed. The relief on her face when she saw him was fleeting, quickly replaced by her baseline of cautious fear. He spent the next few days in a quiet routine, tending to his small patch of land, mending his tack, always aware of her silent presence. He left food for her, which she now ate without hesitation. She started following him, keeping a safe distance as he worked, her bare feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He found an old pair of his wife's boots, worn and soft, and left them by the cot. The next morning, she was wearing them. They were too big, but they were shoes. He never pushed her to speak, but one evening, as he was oiling the revolver by the firelight, she spoke again, her voice still a fragile whisper. "They take name." He stopped his work, looking at her. She was tracing the bead on her neck with a trembling finger. "He say, a name is weakness. Number is strong." She looked up at him, her eyes seeming to ask a question she didn't have the words for. He holstered the pistol and opened a small, locked chest he kept under his cot. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, was a U.S. Marshal's badge, tarnished with age and neglect. He picked it up, the memory attached to it as sharp as a shard of glass. A bank robbery in Wichita. A young teller, a girl no older than this one, caught in the crossfire. His hesitation, his single moment of miscalculation, had cost the girl her life. He'd turned in his badge the next day and ridden west until the world forgot his name. He had failed to protect the innocent once. He would not do it again. He closed the chest, the decision made. The path of least resistance, the quiet life he had built, was a luxury he could no longer afford. He knew he needed more than suspicion, he needed proof. And he knew the only person in Redemption Creek who might have the courage to help him was Martha Gable. As darkness fell, he saddled his horse once more, leaving 7 with a rifle and a single, firm instruction. "Don't open the door for anyone but me." He rode into Redemption Creek under the cover of a moonless night, tethering his horse in a dark alley behind the boarding house Martha ran. He tapped lightly on her back door. After a long moment, the door creaked open a few inches, and Martha's worried face appeared in the gap. "Mr. Thorne. You shouldn't be here." He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I found one of them. A girl. She escaped from the mine." Martha's face went pale, and she quickly pulled him inside, locking the door behind them. The boarding house was silent, its residents asleep. She led him to the small kitchen in the back. "They'll kill you," she whispered, her hands twisting in her apron. "Blackwood owns the sheriff, the whole town council. They'll say she's a thief, a runaway indentured worker, and hang you for harboring his property. Elias's voice was low and steady. What he's doing isn't indenture, Martha. It's slavery. And I need to prove it. A tear traced a path through the flour dust on her cheek. My husband, before he passed, he was the town bookkeeper. He tried to speak out. He saw the payments, the bribes. Blackwood's men paid him a visit one night. They called it a wagon accident. The story hung in the air, thick with old grief and fresh fear. She hesitated, then seemed to find a reservoir of strength deep inside. She went to a loose floorboard beneath the pantry and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger. He kept a private copy, she said, her voice trembling but firm. Everything is in here. Payments to Brody, falsified shipping manifests for equipment that were actually people, a list of numbers next to names. The names he gave them before Blackwood took them away. She pushed the ledger into his hands. It was heavier than any gun. It was the truth. You take this and you ride, she urged. Get it to the territorial marshal in Prescott. It's the only way. As he turned to leave, a floorboard creaked on the front porch. Through the window, Elias saw the glowing ember of a cigarillo in the darkness, one of Brody's deputies, watching, waiting. The trap was sprung. There was no running now. Sheriff Brody and 2 of Blackwood's hired guns arrived just after dawn. They didn't bother with the path, riding their horses right up to the cabin porch. Seven shrank into the shadows, her eyes wide with a familiar terror. Elias stepped outside, the ledger tucked inside his shirt, his hand resting calmly on the butt of his Colt. "Morning, Sheriff," he said, his voice even. "Lost your way?" Brody sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boots. "No, Thorne. But you have. We know you were at the Widow Gable's last night. We know you have something that belongs to Mr. Blackwood. Hand over the girl, and maybe he'll overlook your trespassing." Elias didn't move. "She's not a thing to be owned, Brody. And she's staying here." The 2 thugs behind Brody shifted, their hands moving towards their own guns. The air grew thick and heavy, the silence broken only by the nervous stamping of the horses. Brody's face hardened, the folksy corruption giving way to raw menace. "I'm giving you one chance, Thorne. For old time's sake, maybe. You bring that piece of property to the town square by sundown. You do that, and you can keep living your pathetic little life out here in the dirt. You don't, well, this cabin is mostly dry wood. It would be a shame to see it burn. With both of you inside, the threat was plain, brutal, and public. He wanted to make an example of Elias. He wanted the whole town to see what happened to those who defied Silas Blackwood. Brody and his men wheeled their horses around and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and the weight of an ultimatum hanging in the air. Elias watched them go, his mind racing. He could run. They could try to make it through the Badlands, but they'd be hunted. He was a good tracker, but Blackwood had more men and more money. They wouldn't last a week. He went back inside. Seven was standing by the window, clutching the rifle he'd given her. He had expected to see terror in her eyes, the same paralyzing fear he'd seen since he found her. But instead, he saw something new. A spark. A flicker of defiance, hard and bright as flint. She had been stripped of her home, her family, her name, her very identity. She had nothing left to lose, and in that, she had found a strange, terrible kind of freedom. He looked from her defiant face to the horizon, the sun already beginning its slow climb towards noon. He had a choice. Obey the law of the corrupt and save himself, or defy it and risk everything for a stranger. What would you do? What line would you cross for someone with no name, no voice, no hope? The question hung in the silence of the cabin, not as a thought, but as a judgment. For 5 years, he had chosen himself. He had chosen peace, solitude, and the willful ignorance of the world's evils. That time was over. He walked to the small wooden chest, unlocked it, and took out the marshal's badge. It was dull and heavy in his palm. With a decisive movement, he pinned it to the worn fabric of his vest. It wasn't an act of authority, it was a declaration of intent. He was no longer Elias Thorne, the reluctant rancher. He was the law, not the bought and paid for version that Brody represented, but the fundamental, unshakable law of human decency. He turned to the girl. "They don't call you Seven anymore," he said, his voice imbued with a new gravity. He looked for a name in her features, in the quiet strength that was beginning to blossom from her trauma. He thought of the plum blossoms from the stories his wife used to read, symbols of perseverance and hope that bloom even in the harshest winter. "Your name is Mai." For the first time, a flicker of a smile touched her lips. It was a fragile, beautiful thing. "Mai," she repeated, tasting the word. It was a beginning. The rest of the day was spent not in fear, but in preparation. He didn't fortify the cabin for a siege, that was Brody's plan, not his. Instead, he showed Mai how to handle the heavy Winchester rifle. He showed her how to load it, how to sight it, how to brace its powerful kick against her small shoulder. Her hands, once trembling with fear, became steady and sure. She was a fast learner, driven by a will to survive that he was only just beginning to comprehend. He cleaned and oiled his own revolver, the familiar motions a comforting ritual. He was not the man he was 10 years ago. He was older, slower. But he was also wiser, and he was fighting for something more than a paycheck. As the afternoon sun began to dip towards the western hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood, he knew he couldn't wait for the fight to come to him. A showdown at his isolated cabin would leave no witnesses. Blackwood and Brody would write the history of that fight, and it would be a lie. The battle for the soul of Redemption Creek had to be fought in the open, on the town's main street, where every fearful citizen would be forced to watch and to choose. As the town clock tower struck 5, Elias rode into Redemption Creek, not with the furtive caution of a man in hiding, but with the deliberate pace of a man heading to a reckoning. Mai sat behind him on the horse, her back straight, the Winchester held across her lap. She wasn't his prisoner being delivered for judgment, she was his ward, and he was her champion. He reined his horse to a stop in the very center of the dusty main street. The town was eerily quiet. Faces peered from behind curtains. Shopkeepers stood frozen in their doorways. On the wide porch of the saloon, Silas Blackwood waited. He was impeccably dressed in a fine suit, a stark contrast to the grit of the town he owned. Sheriff Brody and a dozen grim-faced men, all armed, flanked him like chess pieces protecting their king. Blackwood smiled, a thin, arrogant expression. "Thorne," he called out, his voice smooth and confident. "I see you've made the sensible choice. Just hand over the asset, and we can all go about our business." Elias swung down from the saddle, then turned and helped Mai to the ground. He stood between her and Blackwood's men, a lone figure against a small army. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the ledger. "Her name is Mai," he said, his voice quiet but carrying with perfect clarity across the silent square. "And she is not an asset." He held up the ledger for all to see. "And this book says you've been buying the law in this town, Blackwood. It says you've been trafficking people and treating them like cattle. It says your whole empire is built on murder." Blackwood's smile vanished. Brody's face turned purple with rage. "That's enough, Thorne," the sheriff roared, his hand dropping to his gun. But Elias was faster. The years of disuse fell away, and the muscle memory of 100 life-or-death draws took over. His Colt seemed to leap into his hand. He didn't shoot Brody. He fired a single shot into the wooden saloon sign just above the sheriff's head, the crack of the pistol echoing like a thunderclap through the tense silence. Splinters rained down on Brody, who froze, his hand hovering over his gun. The standoff was absolute. Elias stood alone, one man against a dozen, one tarnished badge against a wall of paid-off corruption. The silence that followed the gunshot was profound. It was the silence of a town holding its breath, a community teetering on the precipice between fear and courage. For a long, stretched moment, it seemed fear would win. The faces in the windows remained in the shadows. The doorways remained empty. Blackwood chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "You see, Thorne? You are alone. These people are sheep. They know who feeds them. Now, drop the gun, but he was wrong. The sound of a door creaking open broke the spell. From the general store, Martha Gable emerged, her face pale but resolute. In her hands, she held a heavy double-barreled shotgun, and she leveled it squarely at Blackwood's men. Then another door opened. The blacksmith, a mountain of a man, stepped out holding a blacksmith's hammer like a war club. A rancher appeared with a hunting rifle. The stable hand with a pitchfork. One by one, then in twos and threes, the people of Redemption Creek emerged from the shadows. They were not an army. They were bakers and merchants, farmers and wives, armed with old guns, farm tools, and a righteous fury that had been suppressed for far too long. They formed a silent, determined line behind Elias, their collective presence a far more powerful weapon than any single gun. Blackwood's face twisted in disbelief and rage. His power, built entirely on the illusion of control and the currency of fear, was evaporating before his eyes. He screamed at his men, "Shoot them! Shoot them all!" But his hired guns hesitated, looking from the single, determined lawman to the sea of angry faces surrounding them. They were paid to be bullies, not to fight an entire town. The first thug who raised his pistol was met with the deafening boom of Martha's shotgun, the blast tearing into the saloon wall beside him. That was all it took. The fight was short, clumsy, and utterly decisive. It wasn't a classic Western shootout, it was a communal uprising. The townspeople, emboldened by years of resentment, swarmed Blackwood's men, who threw down their guns and surrendered, overwhelmed by the sheer force of a populace that had finally found its voice. In the chaos, Blackwood tried to slip away, but Elias cornered him against the wall of the saloon. The corrupt kingpin, stripped of his authority, was just a man in a fancy suit, trembling with indignant fury. "You can't do this," he hissed. "I own this town." Elias simply pressed the ledger into his chest. Not anymore. 6 months later, the dust in Redemption Creek seemed different. It settled more gently. The shadow of the Blackwood mine was still on the horizon, but it no longer reached the town. A federal investigation, spurred by the ledger Elias had protected, had dismantled Blackwood's entire criminal enterprise. The mine was now under new management, with fair wages and safe conditions, and the workers who had been held there were liberated, their stories finally being heard. Sheriff Brody was in a federal prison, and the town was now governed by a council of its own citizens, with Martha Gable as its unwavering moral center. Elias Thorne had stayed. He hadn't sought the position, but the town had insisted he act as their protector, their constable. The tarnished badge on his vest was now polished from wear, a symbol not of a painful past, but of a hard-won future. He had found his purpose not in solitude, but in community. His small ranch had become a home. On a warm evening, he sat on his porch, watching my brush the coat of his horse. Her hair had grown back, cut short and neat. The brand on her neck was a pale scar now, a permanent reminder of where she had come from. She no longer flinched from sudden movements, and her voice, once a whisper, was now clear and confident as she spoke to the animal. She was learning to read, her brow furrowed in concentration each night as she traced the words in one of his late wife's books. They had built a quiet life together, a small family forged in the crucible of violence and injustice. She looked up from the horse and caught his eye, offering him the small, genuine smile that still made his heart ache with a protective instinct he had thought long dead. He had ridden out to this empty land to forget how to care. But a lost girl with no name had taught him that redemption wasn't about forgetting the past, it was about building a better future, one brave choice at a time. The sun set, bathing the plains in a soft, golden light, and for the first time in years, Elias Thorne felt at peace. Scene fades to black. Elias Thorne, the actor, now in simple modern clothes, appears against a neutral background. He looks directly into the camera. Every day, we're faced with choices. To look away, or to stand up. What you just saw was a story, but the courage it takes to protect the voiceless is real. It lives in teachers, in first responders, in neighbors who check on the elderly, in anyone who sees an injustice, big or small, and refuses to let it stand. Don't ever be afraid to be the one who stands. If this story meant something to you, hit that subscribe button and click here to watch another story about an everyday hero. Thank you for watching.